who's in charge of, I don't have, there goes Bob, my right-hand man. And Bob, I'm gonna have you advance when I say so, right?
Correct.
Well, that title, Celebrating Humboldt Bay Shorebirds, I just have to go high tech here and take a screenshot. You might see a reflection there, but this is the latest award that came to Humboldt Bay and the complex, which extends from the Eel River mouth north to Mad River, et cetera. But we collectively just received this award as it's the first one given to a site in the United States. That's fine, you can go there. A site in the United States that sort of embodies the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network system of protected areas, and I'll come back to that. But I do want to acknowledge lots of partners. You can read the graphics at the top, but it's those citizen scientists in particular. I'm sure there are a bunch who are tuned in right now, but those are the people who went out and collected the data with me and provided logistical support, Gary and James and Steve, and there's some photos in here that are not mine because I'm an awful photographer, but these are a mix of students and university folks and people from the community who worked with me over a couple of years to provide updated information on Humboldt Bay's importance to shorebirds. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And if Bob can advance the screen for me. There we go. So if you took my shorebirds class, Rob, then you know that there are 215 species of shorebirds worldwide, including a smattering of taxa in different families. Some of them are things like ibisbill from the Himalaya, but sandpipers and plovers are the most noteworthy groups, the most speciose. And I raise this because those 215 species worldwide, it's a remarkable number that has shown up here on Humboldt Bay, not just in the 2 years that folks and I did these surveys, but in the context of all the records locally that date back to when Stan first got here and before. So I'm gonna put the importance of Humboldt Bay in perspective here by talking about flyways first. So if Bob, you can advance. The flyways that exist worldwide number 9, and they typically are oriented on this north-south trajectory that you see here in color. There is another flyway that's in the furthest south of Patagonia with a few species that breed in the south and migrate north. But these flyways connect temperate, boreal, and Arctic breeding areas across the top of the world, if you will, with the wintering areas for the same species that occur on the other side of the equator. And the flyways then are those locations along which populations move. And if you're paying attention to the screen, the red star is obviously Humboldt Bay, which lies within the Pacific Americas flyway. Next slide. So the flyways serve as a foundation for a conservation approach to shorebirds that's referred to as the staging paradigm. And this photo from Mono Lake is one of Wilson's phalaropes. And it represents one of those key wetlands in the life cycle of phalaropes in this case that links the annual cycle. And there are millions, a few million phalaropes in the world, and many of them make use of Mono Lake. So the entire population to some extent occurs at hypersaline lakes, Mono Lake being one of those. And it's there in late spring and summer that post-breeding birds lay down the fat reserves that are essential for them getting to South America if it's a phalarope, and then returning to breed the next year. So that staging paradigm underlies shorebird conservation. Next slide. So if we take the wetland perspective as a critical link in the annual chain of events, this is a photo from April of 2018, when we started the surveys on the bay, the wetlands then are the locations at which large numbers of individuals move through. They stage or stop over. And there's a distinction there that involves how long they stay and how much fat they put on, which is the case for staging birds as opposed to stopovers being shorter. Next slide. So the idea then is that impacts to these sites, human impacts, may have dire consequences for the populations of birds that move along them. And shorebirds really exemplify this. There aren't too many other species that concentrate like this at such a few limited wetlands. And even within shorebirds, there's variation in the extent to which birds concentrate. The extremes might be something like Wilson's phalarope. But as you'll see, Humboldt Bay is one of those locations that right now is hosting a large number of individuals of a diverse community of shorebirds. Next slide. All right, so just to put this in perspective, this is part of Humboldt Bay's, just almost all of it that is recognized under the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. And in the context of California and further north on the coast, it's one of the largest estuaries. And the diversity of shorebirds that we find here is owing to the diverse habitats that you see listed there. So whether it's the tidal flats, which are expansive, right, or the freshwater wetlands that occur in the winter in the yellowed areas that are largely pasture lands now, ocean fronting beaches and rocky intertidal, there's a lot of habitat to support a lot of different species, but there's another factor here, and that's related to Humboldt State University and the people that are associated with it as former students, current students, but lots of birders have been out chasing birds and found lots of the species that have occurred in the Nearctic of North America, Central and South, not South America. Next slide. All right, so what I'm going to do today is just give you our best understanding of the estimates of shorebird abundance here from a year-round perspective, and then talk about how this has improved recognition of this site as one that's important to shorebirds along the Pacific Americas flyway. Next. All right, so brief field methods. On the right, you see an image of Humboldt Bay, and the green, blue, and yellow locations that are numbered happen to be the routes along which folks who participated in that second slide, the acknowledged citizen scientists, along these routes through which individuals moved at high tide in the 2 to 3 hours, counting and in many cases mapping the locations of all the shorebirds that they saw. So I'm not going to go into all the details here, but there are 15 survey routes. And for instance, there's a couple at the marsh. I think Rob covered Clop Lake and McDaniel Slough. Keith Slauson covered the Jacoby Creek area. Other folks covered the center of the bay from the boat. That would have been Gary Friedrichsen and Dave Fix, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all the routes, but just know that everybody had a route that they either walked or drove between spots, or I paddled the Mad River Slough at the 255 bridge that crosses going from east to west at the old mill site. So the basis is the simultaneous counts done by experienced folks who were accomplished in identifying species and also estimating large numbers, as you saw in this slide and the previous one. Next. All right, so a little bit of background on Humboldt Bay. Again, the red dot there. We didn't detect 52 species total. It was closer to 30, 31. But that those 52 species, I'm going to talk about briefly and where they originate. The seasonal abundances on a monthly basis might be as low as a few thousand birds in June to right now when there's easily at times 500,000, mostly sandpipers, especially Western sandpipers. So keep that dot in mind. Obviously, you live there, or many of you do. Next slide. The origins of the birds are coming. Here is a 14 survey summary of the abundance of shorebirds over the course of the surveys that we all did. And on the left is June. Not many birds here in June and May on the other end of the continuum there. But in between the abundances build, and as you can see, the quick passage of birds in April during migration yields at any one time easily 100,000. And if you look at the entire April-May window, it's closer to 500,000. So the winter interval is a period in which generally birds are not moving much, whereas spring, there's a fast northward progression. And in the summer and fall, the pattern of use is slower as birds move from breeding areas south to non-breeding areas. Next slide. All right, here's the total number of species over the same interval. No surprise, in June, when there are very few birds here, we detected just 11 or 12 species. In total, 31 species were detected by folks. And you can see that those numbers are highest in June, in July, August. There's a double September listing there because there were surveys done early and late in September. Anyway, 31 species total of the 52 that have been observed by all folks over the last 60 years. Some of these data come from DOC's efforts at compiling information, but some of it's eBird and other accounts. Next slide. All right, so quickly, the origins of the 52 species that have been seen here at Humboldt Bay derive from a couple of different realms. Next slide. The first might be familiar to you as local breeders, and that includes the snowy plovers on the ocean fronting beaches, black oyster catchers in rocky intertidal habitat, and then spotted sandpipers and killdeer. So there are populations of these birds that breed here. They also have populations elsewhere. These are the local breeders. Next slide. There's a group of species that derive from the Great Basin, including stilts and avocets, killdeer again, mountain plover occasionally, but especially curlews, long-billed curlews, godwits, and willets. Next slide. If we move to the boreal forest, there's a group of species, including notably tringine sandpipers, solitary sandpiper and greater yellowlegs, that end up here, maybe not so often wintering, but in migration. Next. Out on the Alaska Peninsula is a black oyster catcher again, and those birds move down the Pacific coast to winter here to some extent. But I'm going to come back to that marbled godwit that's shown here. There's a separate population breeding there that is the namesake of the Godwit Days Festival, and it's an intriguing story about that subspecies. In Western Alaska, next slide, are a group of subarctic tundra breeding things like black oyster catchers, surf birds. They're actually up in the Alaskan range, Dunlin, least sandpipers, and dowitchers. And then from the north slope of Alaska, the tundra above the Arctic Circle, largely, next slide, are a whole bunch of calidridine sandpipers, more dowitchers, phalaropes, black-bellied plovers, and the other golden plovers, whimbrel, etc. So that's all the Nearctic species, but there's a group that derives occasionally from Palearctic origins. These are wandering birds, vagrants. Next slide. And so notably, those are things like little stint and ruff and things like that occasionally wander here, and they are rarities, right? And there are probably a few species that we're still going to expect to see at some point because they've been seen north of us on the Pacific coast. And it's got to be spoon-billed sandpiper that I'm hoping one day shows up here on the tidal flats of Humboldt Bay. So that's the origin of the 52 species that have been observed here on Humboldt Bay. Next slide. And next slide, there they are collectively, right? So I actually dug through data derived from eBird and Audubon Christmas bird counts and Doc's records to examine winter diversity. That's the window that's sort of November, December, January, February. And what you're looking at is a simple diagram with 0 at the center or just to the left of latitude being the equator. And this is the number of species observed in areas along this latitudinal gradient from the far north in the right, 60, which just a few species up by Anchorage and Homer. But as you move south, the numbers increase, and then across the equator into South America, there's slightly fewer. But Humboldt Bay is kind of unique, and it's unique even in North America, because if you look at the latitude, 40 degrees north latitude, and the sites that you see here north and south, there are significantly more species observed along the Pacific America's flyway, where we sit, than on the other side of the continent, on the Atlantic America's flyway. And I suspect that's because of the continental effect on climate of that, of large land mass. It's colder out east, and estuaries also may not support the birds as well. Next slide. So here's the case study I was referring to. Marbled godwits exist in North America as 3 separate populations identified as the prairie, the Alaskan, and the Hudson's Bay populations. And the estimates for population size are clipped onto this Birds of North America account. And what's interesting is if you look at the Humboldt Bay population of non-breeding marbled godwits, it's about 8,000. And the reason I point this out is this is the most northerly location on the Pacific America's flyway where you have large numbers of marbled godwits. It's also true that you don't have many willets north of here, or avocets, or curlews. In other words, what goes for marbled godwit applies to a number of other species, right? This is a really special place where large numbers of shorebirds overwinter, right? That contributes to the diversity. But the interesting thing about godwits is we've got a mix of birds that winter here. Of the 2,000 birds that breed, estimated on the Alaska Peninsula, recent radiotelemetry of like 8 birds, 2 of them were at Humboldt Bay. So if we take that 8 and the 2, that's a quarter of the Alaska population that winters here on Humboldt Bay. And we also know that we have prairie birds, especially from Alberta, that transit through this area and also almost certainly reside here, because the numbers of wintering birds, 8,000, is far in excess of the 2,000 that are the Alaskan birds. But the western birds from the western prairies provinces of Alberta in particular, marked birds move through here. And so what we end up with here in the winter is a mix. They're marbled godwits, but they're 2 distinct populations. And that makes for an interesting discussion about conservation of these populations, especially when it's near on impossible to determine an Alaskan bird from a prairie bird just based on appearance. Next slide. All right, so in summary, in total, 52 species have been observed over the 60 plus years that people have kept good records. So I'm dating this back to Doc Harris arriving here in 1959. So 52 species total, and including a couple of new additions, and I won't go into those, but on our surveys, just 12 to 26 in any one of those 14 intervals in which we surveyed, but there was a total of 31. So Humboldt Bay, in terms of diversity of shorebirds, is truly exceptional. The abundances mentioned here are based on that earlier slide. spring is the peak of migration, and there could be easily 500,000 birds moving through here very quickly. I think that's a conservative estimate, actually. So next slide. I'm almost done. I mentioned before the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, and way back, 20 years ago, Chet Ogan and folks with Audubon, Redwood Region Audubon, went about proposing the Humboldt Bay complex, not just the bay, but north to the Mad River and south, including the Eel River Delta and lowlands. And they were successful in nominating the location for the international recognition, which is the middle tier of recognition between hemispheric and regional. And I'm not going to go into the details of what these distinctions means in terms of total numbers. Just suffice it to say that based on the work that we did, and I briefly presented, the numbers are greater than what we thought. And we were successful a couple of years back in bumping the recognition to the site of hemispheric importance. And then I'm just going to hold up that plaque again. That's the award that we just got. And so in addition to acknowledging all the folks that have helped on this specific project in documenting these numbers and diversity, there are people that play a role in education and outreach. Friends of the Dunes, Audubon Society, Annie Lindquist up at Trinidad Schools has a program with shorebirds every spring. And then management and conservation. This is largely state, federal, but city groups. City of Arcata's McDaniel Slough. And I had so much to put together to make this case. When the award nomination, the approval came to me about 3 weeks ago, it was a slam dunk to these people. Said, man, this is going to be hard to beat, because all the students that have worked with me and others at Humboldt Bay doing the research, applying that in outreach and education, and also driving management and conservation, including things like recognizing the bay and the associated habitats, as I've just detailed. So I think that's my last slide, and I'll be happy to take, there's another question slide, Bob. Well, we can talk about this, but I think I've hit 30 minutes. So next slide, a couple more. Any questions? Comments?
So I had to leave for just a second, Mark. So what was the estimate of how many birds that we have at any given time on the bay?
In the summer, early summer, I would say late May to late June. If you go down to the marsh and look, you can find a few hundred godwits, marbled godwits, and assorted other, handful of other species. So it's that time of year, we're coming up on it in May and June, when the numbers are down as low as a few thousand, right? But the curlews come back at the end of June, Anyway, the numbers build over the summer with southward migration, and probably on, depending on the timing of that, it could be 40, 50, 60,000 during fall migration, which is prolonged, right? Then we have a winter resident population of roughly 50,000 individuals of the 20, probably 5 species that are regularly seen. And then in the spring, with fast northward migration, it's much faster than in the fall, the numbers turn over very quickly, and easily it's 500,000. And my guess is that that's an underestimate. Did that answer your question, Alex?
Yeah, it did. We were talking about it this morning. I have another question for you. And one time we were out at the marsh, and you had a way of counting this, basically the species. I can't remember how you held your hand to look at it. And you would go, okay, there are I don't know, 1,000 in this group, 1,000 in this group. And so could you tell us how you did that? How you did that?
Some of my former students are probably cursing my answer here, but the training is one that takes practice. And in class, when I teach the lab on flock size estimation, it's coupled to a computer program that is mildly annoying, that flies, caricatures of birds across the screen in front of you in different numbers, so that you continually estimate and then get a gauge on how far high or low you are. But the practice means that there's a real number in this computer program. You continually check your estimates as you get presumably better and better, right, against that number. That's one way to do it in lab. The other way to do it is to provide the same experience with multiple observers, not talking to one another on the edge of the bay, doing the same sort of thing. And in April of 2018, when we started the project, we had a bunch of people at the Marsh Project at the foot of I Street at Clop Lake parking lot, all standing in different locations and estimating to the best of our ability, how many birds do you think are here, right? And then we collectively came together and reached a consensus about what that number was. So it's an estimate, but it's bounded by, and we're all pretty similar in our estimates.
Well, I'm going to ask you some of the questions in the question and answer.
Okay.
So for the survey, did you count any rare or unusual bird sightings, or was it just common shorebird species?
Well, if people encountered rarities, then they were included. But there were, maybe not surprisingly, not many rarities detected, right? And if you're going to get them, it's going to be, in the fall when somebody would have been at a place like Centerville, but we didn't count Centerville and the wetlands at that location. So, I don't think there are any rarities in the data that I showed you from the 2-year effort funded by Audubon and assisted by lots of others. The rarities come from folks, chasing things and finding things. And that's the 52 that have been seen locally that are a mix of Doc's book, eBird, and other accounts.
Thank you. The next question is, does the raptor population wax and wane with the number of shorebirds throughout the season?
It would be falcons that we were talking about specifically. I have seen harriers take a Dunlin, but I think that's rare unless something's injured. But it's the falcons that almost certainly increase and pick off, especially the peeps, Dunlin and Western sandpipers, which are most abundant. There is a resident population of peregrine falcons here that many people know about, right? That breed up and down the coast. And so it's the falcons that would winter here or move through in association with large movements of migrants that we'd be talking about. I don't think they're good data to answer that, really.
Okay, thank you.
Gut reaction is yeah.
Yes, okay. You said the second most important estuary in California. What is it? We're the second. What is the first?
San Francisco Bay, only because it's big. I mean, the WISRN, I'm using Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, WISRN, is a wonderful program to recognize places like Humboldt Bay. There are problems with designations, and I just identified one, right? Well, you would expect San Francisco Bay, how big it is, to be very important, right? All the habitats alone should support way more birds than any other place in California. Humboldt Bay is pretty darn big too, right? So yes. What WISRN doesn't do is correct those abundance estimates for density. And, that's an ecological relationship that's, you could talk about it. In other words, WISRN is great and we have just received our third recognition from the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. And Audubon is using this repeatedly in their conservation efforts. All you got to do is go onto their site, California Audubon, and look at all the blogging and other stuff that's related to the work that I just presented that relates to aquaculture on the bay, oysters in particular.
So we have a question from this woman. She's asking, my 7-year-old daughter is very interested in shorebirds and loves the marsh. Any recommendations on children's books on the subject, especially for Humboldt Bay?
Ooh, children's books for Humboldt Bay, no. But in one of my former students who worked on bartail godwits in New Zealand, my wife just bought for my grandchildren the bartail godwit story. It's on the other side of the Pacific, right? The Asian flyway. But that's one book. There's also an Audubon book put out 10, 15 years ago by Mendocino Audubon chapter that highlights snowy plover, and it's bilingual in Spanish and English, and it tells the tale of a color marked female plover. So those are the two that come to mind that are regional.
Well, thank you. Does this award add any additional protection for the Bay of Humboldt?
Excellent question. No.
Oh dear.
Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network functions only in recognition. And, it is sponsored by a non-governmental organization, Manomet Conservation Science, on the East Coast, the equivalent of Point Blue Conservation Science. It has no teeth, but it's a big flag that anybody can wave in the context of things that happen on the bay that affect the habitats that affect shorebirds.
So this next question sort of falls into that.
Yep.
Right now, there are several major new development projects proposed to impact the area. Are decision makers being made aware of the international importance of Humboldt Bay?
I think so. Audubon has done a good job, and I've been pressing with Audubon and others to have this recent award highlighted in the local news, and that should happen sometime soon. I think the folks locally and also Cal Audubon are on top of that. So, that is the most we can do with this award, is simply bring it to the attention of the public and folks that are with the Harbor District, for instance, who make the decisions about oyster culture.
So the next
As
is
one aspect of things affecting shorebirds.
Thank you. This is partly because San Francisco is an estuary and not a bay, is another question. Okay, thank you for that. And this next one is, I heard earlier in this session throughout the day that we were the 10th cleanest bay in the world. Does our cleanliness help support our vastly diverse number of birds, or would the birds come here solely based on our location?
I think despite the development around and in the bay, the habitats are comparatively pristine here. And so, there's a lot to say in answer to that question. The habitats are altered, but there's still a lot of tidal flat out there, and beaches and rocky intertidal and freshwater habitats that shorebirds can make use of.
Okay. I don't know, your eyes were moving, so I thought maybe you're going to answer that.
There are tangents that I could go into, but I'll refrain.
Well, if you want to, you could. So is Humboldt Bay also an estuary?
It is. Yeah, I'm looking at my old harbor chart from the late 1800s, and where the jetties are now and being repaired. It used to be an opening to the bay that would seal off in the summer, and it was a long time. The Wiyot obviously resided here for a long time before the European explorers coming up the coast in their sailing vessels discovered it. And part of that is that the mouth was not apparent, and it was dangerous too, right? But, it sealed off, I think, to some extent in the late summer, fall.
Well, I think it's probably like something like Big Lagoon, et cetera. It breached in the old days and then closed up.
Perhaps, yeah.
Okay, next question is, how about seeking designation as a national estuarine research reserve, like South Slough Coos Bay, for example?
That is a good point. A long time ago, I discussed this with a group of HSU researchers. And so there's a long-term ecological research program, and estuaries are part of this program. And you're right, that little arm of Coos Bay, which is the South Estuary, is one of those reserves. And, it would take an effort, I think, but it's possible to gain recognition additional to the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network by having one of those reserves designated here. There are also international conventions, one in particular, the Ramsar Convention, which was named after the original location in which it was signed in Iran, Ramsar, Iran in 1971. I think there's teeth in other facets of the Coastal Commission and what they do in regulating expansion of oyster culture and things like that, right? There are other ways to get at protection for the bay than more designation, in other words.
Okay, well, Mark, I'm going to say thank you very much from my point of view, because I have no more questions and answers for you unless one pops up right now.
We do have a few in the chat. Would you like to?
Oh, okay, I'll go to the chat.
Fire away. I'll let you manage those.
There's one, where do godwits go in Alberta?
They're breeding in the prairies in the, east of the Rockies. There's an expansive amount of prairie that includes habitat for upland sandpiper and long-billed curlews, but it's south of the parklands, which is aspen habitat. It's where I worked on phalaropes back in the 80s. So there are godwits there. And one of my former grad school colleagues working for the Canadian Wildlife Service banded birds in Alberta. And those marked birds showed up at places like Bolinas, or rather Bodega Bay, and we've seen them here too.
There's a question about your thoughts on technology and shorebird migrations.
But a lot of those prairie birds, there's a lot more than those around James Bay or on the Alaska Peninsula. They fan out across the Gulf Coast and on.
You're frozen. Something happened. Mark is frozen.
There were some connectivity issues earlier. Maybe Mark, turn off the camera for just a minute and it might work better.
Need to refill his beer.
There he is. Now you're muted.
Now can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know what happened there, but I must have talked for a minute or so without anybody hearing me.
We had a question about technology. I'm trying to find that one. It was a good question. Oh, your thoughts on technology and shorebird migration, such as chips on wings, etc.
Yeah, the chips used to be embedded as larger things. Now they're on bands on the legs and sometimes glued to the back. I don't think they're on wings, but the systems of monitoring those birds are used for other migratory birds, including the towers that automatically register when a bird that's marked and has a transmitter of a particular frequency moves through the area. So you can get a lot more details on the movements of individuals for sure.
And how is climate change changing our population of shorebirds?
We don't know the answer to that, but if you consider the bay and the tidal areas of the bay as rimmed by the levees and use the bathtub analogy, any elevation in sea level is going to diminish the extent and time that birds can feed on the bathtub that's slowly filling up. Now, one thing that's a real plus is that McDaniel Slough area where the levee was breached, and this was a City of Arcata, Cal Fish and Wildlife, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service project. And that location is hands down the place to bird for shorebirds on Arcata and all of Humboldt Bay, if you're just looking for sheer numbers. And that is a habitat that was, where the levee was breached. And so there's an upslope restoration of intertidal habitat, salt marsh. And so that's hopeful, but how many other places can we do that around the bay to accommodate for the sea level rise that's coming?
There's a question about what are the most abundant species in Humboldt Bay during spring migration?
Western sandpiper, by far. Yeah, that little peep is the one that probably 500,000, and that's conservative because the turnover, that's the length of time that an individual Western sandpiper stays at Humboldt Bay is about 3 to 4 days on its way north. It's heading hell bent for the Alaska, Yukon, Kuskokwim Delta. So they're moving through fast. Every 3 to 4 days, the average bird is on its way. It's here for 3 to 4 days, then gone. And our surveys were 2 weeks apart. Well, that accounts for almost easily complete population turnover. And our estimates of 500,000 in the spring alone, it's almost certainly higher because birds are moving through faster than that. We may have, 200% or 300% turnover. That's a guess during the same 2-week window, right?
There's also a question on what future studies you would like to see to help further our knowledge of and enhance conservation of shorebirds around Humboldt Bay.
Ooh, that's, I think that's an individual species response. And, it depends on which species we're talking about. My heart has been for 20 years with snowy plovers in the sense that as a threatened species, there's a lot that still could be done to manage habitats for them. But of the ones that aren't local breeders, I think, it'd be marbled godwits and understanding more about the distribution of those individuals up and down the Pacific coast and how important Humboldt Bay is compared to Grays Harbor, Willapa Bay, and then further south estuaries.
And then they say, how do you know that the WASA stay for just 3 to 4 days? How do people determine that?
Good question. There was work done by Nils Warnock, who's now at Audubon Canyon Ranch just south of here on Tamales Bay. And Nils coordinated a lot of people, including one of my former grad students. But at the time, Ryan Mathis was an undergrad, and they had people up and down the coast with Yagi antennas on receivers that were monitoring individual frequencies for the birds that were marked during spring migration south of here. And so the birds would come in and Ryan would find them on the bay, and every bird has a particular frequency such that you knew that 3 or 4 days later it was no longer there, right? So, and people were doing this all up and down the Pacific coast, and it was 20 or so years ago that this went on. But that's how they get this turnover rate and how long length of stay is for individual Western sandpipers. In the fall, the lengths of stay of individuals are longer for a variety of species. It's just not as pressing for them. They don't have to get north to breed. It's like, okay, we're going to take our time and we're going to go south, but we're going to feed along the way and molt a little and then get to where we have to go ultimately. So they take a longer time. And so the fall migration starts in the end of June. And depending on the species, well, if you take all the species, it's still going on into late October here.
There are also a lot of compliments and comments in the chat too. There's some great ones.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm sorry about the mix up on my old computer that I tried to work off. I'm glad we worked this out so that I can do it from my iPad. I'm about to lose power. In fact, I'm at 13%. So if there's one last question, it better be asked or I'm going to go, I'm going to have no option.
Hey, Mark, thanks again for doing this presentation. It was super informative, and I think a lot of people learned a lot of information from it. And
Good.
maybe we should plug our trip tomorrow that I and you are doing tomorrow.
You read my mind. Where I meet you at McDaniel Slough Levee at what time? 4 o'clock?
Yeah, should we do McDaniel Slough Levee, or should we do at the foot of Ice Street?
You mean the parking lot? Either way, you
Yeah.
call it. You're the boss.
Okay. Yeah, why don't we do 4 o'clock? I mean, not 4 o'clock, of course, before 4 o'clock, but
Yes.
We'll be doing our trip at 4 o'clock from around the foot of Ice Street on Humboldt Bay, where Mark and I will be looking to see the shorebird fly off and documenting it. And I'll be using my phone and my scope and have my phone up to the scope, and hopefully we'll be able to document some of the big shorebird flocks flying off the flats around then. And we'll be there from 4 to 5 p.m. I believe. Is that right? I think that's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So let me ask one other question I see in the chat then.
Yep.
Are you going to walk down to McDaniel Slough from I Street?
I think that's the best place to be. Yeah. The
All very
levee,
possible.
the breach in the levee is probably the prime spot to go.
And so then Keith says to you, what about 420 question mark?
I think he's referring to some celebratory day there.
Oh,
What is
okay.
he talking?
Okay. Maybe it has nothing to do with birds.
Keith,
Is that what you mean?
Keith,
Keith, what are you doing, man? That's like
go eat some
that's
dinner,
like Zoom
drink
bombing.
some water, pal. Go eat some dinner, drink some water. Get out of here.
Well,
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
And Rob,
We'll see you tomorrow.
tomorrow morning, Rob, you have a Arcata Marsh with Gary Bloomfield.
This
and
is
that's gonna
correct.
be- And that's going to be Facebook Live. We will do it as, we'll try to broadcast it here as well, but you might have better reception if you tune into the Godwood Day Facebook page.
Yep, Godwood Day's Facebook page at 8 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. And yeah, we'll start there and we'll talk about a little bit what we're doing. And we're basically also going to be using my phone and trying to scope as many birds as possible on Facebook Live from 8 to 9 a.m. So a big hour, a phone scoping big hour at the Arcata Marsh. So Gary Bloomfield and I, it should be a great time. Hopefully we'll see some migrants. And yeah, I think that's about it.
All
Should be a
right,
good day.
sounds exciting. Make it a
All
wrap.
right, cool. All right, see you guys all tomorrow. Bright and early.